Yo, hello. We are getting anniversary quests, and that means a bunch of free summons and not as many orbs, but we do get a lot of tickets, including tickets for free seasonal units that we had up to, I believe, New Year Leth and New Year Alphon, so it's a pretty good amount of units overall. But as with a lot of these old units, a lot of their capabilities or fodder potential is much more limited in scope, and I figured this be a good video just to have around in case you weren't sure on what exactly you wanted to summon. But if there was something you did potentially want, then you could always use this as a reference. Anyway, as you can see, it is a massive list of seasonals that not only has a fair amount of stuff that you could potentially fodder off, but also has a lot of duds that you may not necessarily want. So if we were to remove all those duds, and this is definitely much more subjective in nature, you end up with this list, which has a fair amount of units that you could use to a relatively decent success. Veilers, fodder, rallies, and some bottom category that I just thought was funny for, you know, the giggles and the ha-has because they have funny weapons. Regardless, in terms of solid units, it's definitely way more debatable in nature because a lot of them are really old, to be fair, but a good amount of them are actually really competent, and even some of the ones that are a bit more outdated can still be used to a relative success. For example, somebody like Halloween Murho has a really good amount of physical bulk. She debuffs for 10 attack, she gets 10 attack on her own, and she gets damage reduction on any of the foe's follow-up attacks, which is usually either their double or their third and fourth strike, for 70%, aka just Black Eagle rule, and she gets a guaranteed follow-up with her weapon. So it's actually relatively nice for the most part. We do have a lot more options when it comes to armors in general, but as a dragon armor, her weapon is still relatively decent in my opinion. And we also have access to the distant counter seal for dragon, so if you even wanted to make her into a far save, you could really do that too. She has a lot of options at her disposal, and in my opinion, she's not a bad near save or far save armor by any means. Picnic Fiora is also relatively good in my opinion. She isn't exactly the greatest because she's a ranged armor and doesn't get access to stuff like Hardy Fighter that would allow her to tank a lot of ranged threats, especially nowadays. But she does get a lot of stats from her weapon. She gets first hit damage reduction, and even though this is a bit more niche, she does have beast effectiveness, so if you did ever need that in some scenario, you could always use it. As for Summer Tana, her niche definitely got superseded by the likes of Guidance 4, or even free units such as Ash, who could just have it in her C slot. Her whole thing is that she was able to allow units to teleport within 2 spaces of her, which is really, really good. And while I do think that does make her less compelling, I still think just having an extra warper around, especially considering Guidance and all those are really expensive, isn't a bad thing by any means. Although if you did want to try for units that were a lot better, you could either go for New Year Alphonse, Winter Ephraim, or Summer Lin. New Year Alphonse is basically blue duo Asker. He has his button, which is really good for charging up specials to himself and infantry allies. He gets a lot of bulk of his specialist charge, which is going to be really easy because he has his button. And he has a decent enough kit as is. You would eventually want to replace it, especially if you're going to use it in higher areas. But as far as free kits go, Close Counter Spiral 4 isn't bad by any means. You also have Winter Ephraim, who definitely needs a kit overhaul, and that's pretty much going to apply to pretty much every single unit here because they're really, really old. He does get enemy phase brave if he has more attack than the foe, and he does heal per hit and has slaying. So he could actually be a really confident near save or potential far save because he is blue. As long as he's able to soak and counter attack, he should be able to heal back whatever he takes. It is again going to be relatively expensive, but Winter Ephraim can be really competent with the right kit. Summer Lin, I think her biggest thing is definitely going to be her damage output. It's by no means necessarily bad, but it's definitely not the best as we see nowadays. She does have an armor and flying effective bow, which is really nice. She gets tempo, a bunch of stats, and she gets sweep. So as long as you're able to make a speed check and you're able to get a good amount of damage out, she should still be able to do a good amount of work, especially if she's able to double. Leguian is also a really nice pickup if you could get her. She has reverse desperation. She gets a lot of attack and speed, and she has no follow-up, so she's rarely, if ever, going to struggle to double in most scenarios. As long as you're able to fulfill her condition, which should be really, really easy to do, I don't think you're going to struggle with her whatsoever. And as for Felicia and Veronica also has a warp thing, but she also grants visible buffs, and while her warp isn't nearly as big as Tana's, she does hit way harder. So I think comparatively, if you're looking for a damage dealer, she might be a bit better, but if you're looking for a decent utility unit, Tana's definitely going to be a lot better. And as for Felicia, she does also debuff a lot of stats. She has half no follow-up, and she has damage reduction, which is really, really nice for just tanking and getting damage out. I personally wouldn't run her as a far save because there's so many prevalent red nukes with armor effectiveness that just absolutely ruin her day. But I think as a near save, she'll definitely succeed a lot more, especially with her beast effectiveness, because there's going to be a better chance that she's going to be able to get that going, as opposed to Flora, who's a ranged armor. Regardless, the big thing is that she gets damage reduction, half no follow-up, and a bunch of stats. So if you're looking for a decent enough tank, you may need to invest a bit of flowers, but I think she could do a decent amount of work. Winter Sothis also falls in line with that, except she also has access to the distant counter seal. And while she does also have armor weaknesses, she doesn't have a dragon effective weakness, which can be really, really nice. Even though it's not nearly as common as armor effectiveness, it's still something that could always come in clutch, especially for units that might have that effectiveness. But again, her thing is also that she has damage reduction, no follow-up, a bunch of stats, but she also has a PRF special that deals damage and heals her. New Year left, a bunch of attack and speed. The new beast effect, if you didn't already refine it, which is really good. No follow-up. Phantom speed, she's incredibly fast and she's incredibly hard-hitting. I think she's pretty good on that front. And as for Winter Marth, I would argue he's probably one of the best far saves we have in the game currently. Even though you do need to invest a lot into him to get him going, he is the only far save currently that works off with something like preempt / advantage, which is basically built into his weapon. And because he also has half no follow-up and reverse desperation, he's going to be able to provide a lot of defensive pressure for units that would otherwise be able to nuke a lot of your armors. And as long as he's able to vantage and kill, then there's a good chance that most units are not going to try and initiate on him, which is incredible. But again, the big thing is that you just try and get the fodder for him. And if you do end up getting him, I would highly recommend building him. He's a very solid unit. And lastly, we have New Year Selkie and Bride Fjorm. New Year Selkie, similar thing with a lot of the other units. She gets a lot of stats, damage reduction, no follow-up. And she also has a new beast effect, which was basically additional first hit damage reduction and stats. So she could become a massive tank if really needed to. Even though enemy phase calves aren't exactly the best, you can still run her as a mixed phase unit and she should be able to succeed with a relatively decent amount of success. And while I do think Bride Fjorm has definitely lost a bit of value because of Freyr just neutralizing any sort of penalty, including her isolation, and Milla already existing in Light Season, you could still use Fjorm in Astra Season if there isn't an enemy Freyr on the opposing team, which could still come in handy for shutting off dancers. Also, she has no panic drive, which can be really nice for any sort of tank that might have otherwise been penalized. And as far as solid units go from this batch, I think these are probably the best 15 you could go for. That being said, if you're not really compelled to pull based on the viability, you could always go for Veilers, Fodder, or Rally Plus, or Harsh Command Plus, or anything of the sort. I think the next best thing you could go for are Veilers because they make grinding and getting SP so much easier. And a lot of the Veiler skills are currently seasonal locked to one unit from like ages ago. So even if you don't really plan to use somebody like Dancer Shigori for a lot of content, he's still the only unit with Blue Tome Veiler, meaning that if you just wanted to grind up any sort of Blue Tome, he's going to make it way faster. Same thing with Tharja, Elise, Tiki, Robin, all of these. Elise and Mist also double dip in that front because they both have Green Tome Veiler, but there's a good amount of Veilers in all of the colors to where you might actually have a good chance at getting one regardless. And again, I think if you're just looking for something that could be of use, even outside of unit viability, Veilers are probably the next best step. But otherwise, you could go into the fodder category, which is definitely a lot more subjective because some of these skills aren't exactly as good nowadays, but some of them could still be used with a relative success, or if you just need them for scoring, then you could use them there. For example, Ike and Hector both have distant counters, so if you did want distant counter available to somebody, you have it there. Gunther and Hrid don't exactly have the best C slots, to be honest, but it does score 300 SP, which if you did want it for arena purposes, it is there. Meanwhile, you have Spring Paula, Dancer Ishtar, Bath Ryoma. Ryoma has a decent inheritable that just grants 2 cooldown at the start of turn 1, which can be really nice for Gale Force purposes. Ishtar has Swift Sparrow 3. Paula has Disarm Trap. Pent, Hector, Grail, Fury, Distant Counter again, Pulse Smoke, and Rally Plus. So if you didn't need any of those skills in particular, you have them available. Wold, Brazen Attack Speed 4, which isn't good, but it's a tier 4 skill, so if you just wanted it to have around, you can, but Distant Counter also scores the same, so yeah, it's really just here because it has the yellow border. Summer Levitain, Bride Lyn, Mirror Impact, Dazzling, Wrathful, Candlelight. Lyn especially isn't too bad just for neutralizing any sort of counter attacks if you don't have any other unit built for that nature, and you could always give the staff to somebody else if you don't want to use her in particular. And then there's also just a lot of other miscellaneous staffs that have Wrathful or Dazzling, or other units that have Disarm, Trap, Lethal Care, which we don't actually have as a normal pull weapon. It's just a wooed out dagger, which I don't think is bad by any means. It is additional damage, so if you just wanted to do something funny, or if you just wanted to secure extra damage with a lethality, you could always try that. Granted, it's not exactly the craziest weapon, but I think you could definitely find usage for it. Halloween Mia has her Melancholy thing with the Witchy Wand, which just guard smoke and all that, which could be really good for Rocker Sieges if that ever returns. And Bath Sakura, who has Grand Scratcher, which is really, really nice just for getting charges off on an ally for the unit that has the highest attack on your team. I don't think that's bad by any means. And lastly, it's really just rallies and funny inheritables. The rally pluses and the harsh command pluses are very self-explanatory. They all have high scoring assists that you could grab if you really want it. Some have overlapping skills that you could also use for other purposes, such as Veilers or inheritable sea slots or anything of the sort that could really be beneficial to you and your team, especially if you don't want to kill them off. And while the last tier doesn't actually have any bearing on anything, I figured it was funny and I wanted to put it here. Because let's be honest for a second, if you have a unit that you really like that's an axe or a lance, you don't think you want to give them like a giant spoon or a giant carrot or a tree as a weapon? Even though they're not good, they are funny, and I figured they'd be worth putting here, especially if you don't really care what you want. Just some sort of funny inheritable to have around. I think these are pretty nice options. But this is also the shortest of the bunch, so if I missed any that you think are really funny, let me know down below. And yeah, this is really going to be about it for the video. Let me know what seasonals you're going to try and go for, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.